The piano tuner arrived at 11 in the morning, looked at the Steinway for maybe 4 minutes, and told Evelyn Marsh it wasn't worth fixing. She didn't say anything right away. She just stood in the doorway of her mother's living room with her coat still on and her keys still in her hand, and she watched the man snap his case shut like the conversation was already over. "The soundboard is cracked," he said. "You can see it there, along the bass bridge. Once that goes, the whole instrument loses integrity. You're looking at a full rebuild, soundboard replacement, restringing, regulation, voicing. Cost you more than the piano's worth, honestly." He glanced around the room, at the wallpaper her mother had picked out in 1987, at the framed photos on the mantel, at the piano itself, a 1962 Hamburg Steinway Model B that had been in the family for 31 years. Denote it, or call a salvage company. The cabinet's still pretty. He let himself out. Evelyn sat down on the bench. The keys were cool under her fingers. She didn't play. She'd never learned. Not past the basics her mother had tried to teach her when she was 9, but she pressed a single note anyway. Middle C. It sounded clear and full, and nothing like something that was dying. Her mother had played every morning before breakfast. That was the thing no one outside the family would ever know. Not concerts, not performances. Just 30 minutes every morning, alone in this room, before the day started. Evelyn had grown up to that sound, had fallen asleep to it on Sunday afternoons, had come back to it after her husband left, after the miscarriage, after the years that didn't go the way she'd planned. The piano hadn't moved from that corner in 3 decades. She called 2 more tuners over the next week. The second one quoted her $14,000. The third said the crack in the soundboard had likely been there for years, and the piano had been compensating, his word, but that it was past the point of no return. He recommended a dealer in Mississauga who bought old Steinways for parts. $14,000, or a parts dealer in Mississauga. She sat with that for a few days. Then her neighbor Patrice mentioned a name. The shop was on a side street in Hamilton, between a dry cleaner and a place that sold used office furniture. There was no sign out front, just a small piece of paper taped inside the window that said, "Column Instrument Repair" in plain black letters, and below that a phone number with a local area code. The window was clean. The door was unlocked. Evelyn pushed it open. The smell hit her first. Wood and rosin and something metallic like machine oil, but faint. The front room held 2 upright pianos in various states of being taken apart, a cello with no strings, and a workbench along the far wall covered in small parts organized in labeled trays. A radio played quietly somewhere in the back. Classical, she thought, or close to it. A girl appeared in the doorway to the back room. Maybe 9 or 10, with dark hair pulled into a lopsided braid and a book held open with one finger marking her place. "Hi," the girl said. "Are you here to pick something up or drop something off?" "I'm here to talk to someone," Evelyn said. "Is your father here?" The girl considered this. "He's with a harpsichord. Could you let him know I'm here? You can just go back. He doesn't mind." Evelyn followed her through the doorway. The back room was larger than she'd expected. 3 more instruments in various stages of repair. A wall of tools she couldn't name. And in the far corner, crouched low over a harpsichord that had been laid on its side on a padded table, was a man in a gray t-shirt and work pants, using a small light to look at something inside the case. He didn't look up right away. "Give me 1 second," he said. His name was Thomas Vick. Patrice had told her that much. She'd said he was quiet, that he was good, and that he'd fixed a violin for her daughter that 2 other shops had turned away. She hadn't said much else. He looked up eventually. Late 30s, maybe 40. There was grease under one fingernail that he'd clearly tried to clean. He had the kind of face that looked like it was used to concentrating, not unfriendly, just specific. "Sorry about that," he said, standing. He extended his hand. "Tom Evelyn. My neighbor, Patrice Gendron, gave me your name." "I know Patrice." A small nod. "What have you got?" Evelyn explained about the piano, the 3 tuners, the soundboard, the $14,000 quote, the parts dealer in Mississauga. Tom listened without interrupting. He didn't write anything down. He just stood with his arms at his sides and listened, and when she finished, he asked 2 questions. How old is the piano? 62 years. And when you play a note, any note, does it sustain? She thought about middle C. Yes. It sounded completely normal to me. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, when can I see it? He came on a Thursday morning. He brought a canvas bag of tools, and his daughter, who sat in her grandmother's armchair and continued reading her book while Tom walked a slow circle around the piano without touching it. Evelyn watched from the hallway. He crouched down and looked at the legs. He stood and looked at the lid. He lifted the fallboard and examined the keys, not playing them, just looking. Then he asked her to leave the room for a few minutes. She went to the kitchen and made tea. When she came back, he was sitting on the bench with both hands flat on the closed keyboard lid, eyes closed, just sitting. The girl had looked up from her book and was watching her father with a calm, familiar expression. The expression of someone who had seen this before and knew what it meant. Evelyn set the tea on the side table and waited. After maybe 2 minutes, Tom opened his eyes. The soundboard isn't cracked, he said. She blinked. Every tuner I spoke to said, there's a separation. That's different. The wood pulled away from the inner rim here. He pointed to a spot along the bass side, probably from years of temperature changes, humidity fluctuations. Old houses breathe, and the piano breathed with it. He paused. A separation can be re-glued. If you do it correctly, the soundboard integrity is fully restored. It's not a rebuild, it's a repair. Evelyn stared at him. The reason your notes sustain is because the board itself is structurally sound. It's separated at the edge, not across the grain. That's a completely different problem. Whoever looked at this either didn't look closely enough, or he stopped. Either they didn't look closely enough. He didn't say the other thing. He didn't need to. How much, she said. He told her. It was not $14,000. It was not a parts dealer in Mississauga. She asked him twice to make sure she'd heard correctly. He said yes, he was sure. There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It moves in quietly, the way cold air moves under a door. You don't notice it until everything in the room is already different. Thomas Vick had been living inside that grief for 3 years. His wife, Anna, had died on a Tuesday in October. A car accident on the 403, the kind that happens fast and leaves no room for any of the things you meant to say. Felicity had been 6 years old. She didn't remember the drive home from the hospital, or the first week after, or much of that winter. What she remembered, she had told her father once, was that the house got quiet, and that he started spending more time in the shop. Tom had been a mechanical engineer before, 10 years at a firm in Toronto, the kind of work that paid well and looked good on paper and required a certain way of thinking about problems, systematically, precisely, without sentiment. He'd been good at it. He'd also, slowly, over years, started to feel like he was disappearing inside it. He'd always repaired things. As a kid, as a teenager, through university. Instruments, specifically, his grandmother had played violin, and he'd grown up watching her take it apart and put it back together with a patience that seemed to him almost devotional. He'd learned from her, he'd kept learning on his own. After Anna died, the engineering firm gave him 3 months of leave, and at the end of 3 months he didn't go back. He opened the shop in Hamilton with what they had in savings, and a month of anxiety so severe he lost 8 pounds. Felicity started school. He found a routine. He was not unhappy. That surprised him sometimes. He was tired, often. He missed Anna in the specific ways that don't come up in grief literature, the way she'd left cabinet doors open, her handwriting on the grocery list, the fact that she'd always known which of their neighbors were fighting and which were just dramatic. He missed knowing what she would have thought. He missed having someone to tell things to at the end of the day. But the work was real in a way that felt necessary. Every instrument that came in had a problem that could be understood, and if you were patient enough, it could be solved. There was something stabilizing about that, something that felt, on the better days, like grace. The Steinway took him 3 weeks. He worked on it in the evenings, after Felicity was in bed, using techniques his grandmother had shown him and some he'd worked out himself over years of trial and calibrated error. The separation required a specific type of hide glue and a clamping setup he had to partially improvise, because the piano's inner dimensions were unusual. Hamburg Steinways from that era had slightly different proportions than their New York counterparts, something he'd read about years ago and now found to be practically relevant in a way that felt, briefly, like a gift. He regulated the action. He voiced the hammers. He tuned it 3 times over 2 days, listening for the places where it wanted to go flat or sharp, letting it settle. On the last evening, before he drove back to Hamilton, he played a chord. He wasn't a pianist. He had enough knowledge to test and not enough to perform. But he held the chord and listened to it ring through the room, through the old wallpaper and the framed photos and the afternoon light on the floor, and he thought about the woman who had played here every morning for 31 years. He thought she would have approved. Evelyn was in the backyard when Tom finished. Her neighbor Patrice was with her. When Tom came to the door and said it was done, both women followed him inside. He stood back. Evelyn sat on the bench. She placed her hands on the keys, not with any technique, just honestly, and she played the opening notes of the only piece she'd ever half learned, something her mother had taught her at 9 years old from a beginner's book. She got about 6 bars in before she stopped. She sat there for a moment with her eyes closed. "It sounds like her," she said. Patrice had her hand over her mouth. Tom picked up his canvas bag and waited quietly near the door, looking at the window, giving them the moment because it wasn't his. He might have driven back to Hamilton that afternoon and that would have been the end of it, a job completed and paid for and filed quietly among the others. But Patrice stopped him at the door. "I want to ask you something," she said. She was in her mid-60s, a woman who had the manner of someone who said what she meant and expected you to do the same. "My son-in-law works for a heritage foundation. They restore old instruments for concert use, not just pianos, everything. Pipe organs, harpsichords, historical pieces from the 18th century. They've been looking for someone who can consult on mechanical problems, the complicated ones that the regular restorers get stuck on." Tom said he wasn't really set up for that kind of thing. Patrice said, "I'm not asking if you're set up for it. I'm asking if you're interested." He thought about Felicity, who had school until 3:30. He thought about the shop, which needed him and which he had built carefully and which was, finally, after 2 years, beginning to sustain itself. He thought about the harpsichord he still had in the back room, and the cello with no strings, and the upright piano from a church in Dundas that had water damage along the bass register. He said he would think about it. Patrice handed him a card. He didn't call right away. He thought about it for 10 days, which was longer than he usually took to decide things. Then, Felicity asked him at dinner one evening what the card on his workbench was. He told her. She listened with the serious attention she gave to most things, which was one of the traits she'd gotten from Anna and which still caught him off guard sometimes. "Do you want to do it?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "That usually means yes," she said, and went back to her dinner. He called the next morning. The Heritage Foundation was called the Trent Workshop, and it operated out of a converted mill building in the west end of the city. The director was a woman named Calloway, Dr. Renata Calloway, who had spent 20 years as a musicologist before pivoting, she said, into what she called the physical side of the work. She showed him around on a Thursday afternoon while Felicity sat in the reception area with a sandwich and her library book. The space was extraordinary. High ceilings, good light, and more historical keyboard instruments in one room than Tom had ever seen in his life. A Rucker's double manual harpsichord in pieces on a conservation table. 3 antique fortepianos arranged along the east wall. A Baroque organ in the far corner that looked like it had been disassembled and was waiting to understand why. "That one," Dr. Calloway said, nodding toward the organ, "is the reason I called Patrice," she explained. The organ had come from a small church in rural Quebec, dating to the early 19th century. The Trent workshop had been restoring it for 8 months. The pipes were in good condition. The wind chest had been cleaned, the bellows repaired. But when they tried to play it, the voicing was wrong. Not off in the normal ways that came from age and neglect, but wrong in a way no one could locate. The sound was uneven across the manual, with several ranks of pipes producing a beating pattern that shouldn't have been there. 2 specialists had looked at it, neither had found the source. Tom walked over to the organ and crouched down to look at the toe board, the panel at the base where the pallets sat. He didn't touch anything, he just looked. After a minute he asked Dr. Calloway if she had the documentation for the recent restoration work. She brought him 3 binders. He sat at a table and read for an hour, while Dr. Calloway did other work, and Felicity fell asleep in the reception chair with her book on her chest. What he was looking for wasn't in the work logs. It was in the measurements, specifically, a set of toe hole dimensions from the original pipe rack that had been recorded by the first specialist and then not referenced again. The holes were slightly undersized relative to standard practice for that period. Not wrong exactly, just specific to how this organ had been voiced originally. The restoration team had replaced the pallets with new ones built to modern specification. The new pallets were covering the toe holes by an additional 2 millimeters. 2 millimeters, enough to alter the airflow to specific ranks, enough to create exactly the beating pattern Dr. Calloway had described. Tom explained this to her when she came back. She looked at him for a long moment. "How long did it take you to find that?" she said. "About an hour, but I had the documentation." "We had the same documentation. You were looking for something that had gone wrong," he said. "I was looking for something that had changed." That was the distinction. He tried to explain it to Felicity on the drive home, which was probably too technical for a 9-year-old, but she listened anyway with her head against the window. The 2 specialists had approached the organ as a restoration problem. Something broken that needed to be returned to function. They'd checked all the obvious things, the pipes, the chest, the bellows, the action. When those were fine, they'd checked them again. They were looking for damage. Tom had looked for difference. He'd compared what the organ was now against what the documentation said it had been, not as it should be in theory, but as it specifically, individually, had been built. And the difference was in the pallets. "Like when you fixed Mrs. Hebert's violin," Felicity said. "Kind of, yeah. You said the other guy was fixing it like it was a normal violin, but it was actually a specific violin. That's exactly it." She seemed satisfied. She looked back out the window. Tom drove for a while in the quiet. "Did you like it there?" Felicity asked eventually. "I did," he said. "I liked the building," she said. "It smelled old, but in a good way." He began consulting for the Trent workshop on a part-time basis, Thursdays and occasional Fridays with Felicity at school. The arrangement worked well enough that by the 3rd month Dr. Calloway began showing him things before they brought in anyone else. There was a fortepiano from 1790 with an escapement problem no one could locate. There was a clavichord with a damper issue that turned out to be a previous repair done with the wrong gauge of cloth. There was a 19th century cabinet organ with bellows that had been patched incorrectly, creating a pressure inconsistency so subtle that it only showed up in the upper dynamic range. Something you couldn't find by looking, only by playing. Tom found all of them, not always quickly, not always on the first visit, but eventually. Word moved the way word moves in small professional worlds. Slowly at first, then all at once. A restoration specialist in Montreal contacted him about a pipe organ in a heritage church. A museum in Ottawa had a collection of Victorian parlor instruments that hadn't been properly assessed. A private collector in Vancouver had paid restoration fees on a Broadwood Grand that still didn't sound right. He didn't take everything. He kept the shop in Hamilton, kept the work that was local and manageable, kept the Thursday schedule that let him pick Felicity up from school. He turned down 2 opportunities that would have required travel. He said no to a university fellowship that sounded important but would have meant leaving for a year. Felicity never asked him not to go. She wasn't the kind of kid who said things like that. But he knew. He knew the way you know things about someone you've raised on your own, through years of small mornings and the specific grammar of how they went quiet. He wasn't going to trade this time for something that looked better on paper. He'd done that already, once, and he'd learned. The call from the National Heritage Museum came on a Wednesday in November. A conservator there, a man named Dr. Fenn, had heard his name from the Montreal specialist. The museum had acquired an instrument the previous spring, a fortepiano that had allegedly belonged to a notable early Canadian composer, provenance partially established but not complete. They had been trying to authenticate the instrument through physical examination. Their own conservators were divided. Two believed the instrument was genuine. Two believed it had been significantly altered in the 20th century, and the provenance was questionable. Dr. Fenn wanted a third opinion from someone with no institutional stake in the outcome. Tom told him he'd need to see the instrument in person and would need access to all existing documentation. Dr. Fenn said, of course. Tom told Felicity about it that evening. She was doing homework at the kitchen table and he was making dinner, and he told her the way he told her most things, directly, without softening it. "You'll have to miss a day of school," he said. "We'd go on a Friday." She looked up. "You're bringing me, unless you'd rather stay with Patrice." She thought about this for approximately 1 second. "I want to come." The museum was in Ottawa. They drove up on a Friday morning in October, Felicity with her backpack and a thermos of hot chocolate, Tom with the canvas bag. They arrived at the museum just after noon. The fortepiano was in a climate-controlled examination room in the lower level. Dr. Fenn met them at the door, a tall man in his 50s, careful in his movements, the kind of person who chose his words like he chose his tools. He showed Tom the documentation. He showed him the existing reports from the 4 conservators. He explained what was at stake: a major acquisition, a significant donor relationship, and an exhibition that was already in planning stages contingent on the instrument's authentication. Tom read everything. Then he asked to be left alone with the instrument. Dr. Fenn hesitated, very slightly. Then he nodded and took Felicity to see the permanent collection. Tom spent 2 hours with the fortepiano. He measured the string lengths and compared them against period specifications for Viennese instruments of the same approximate date. He examined the hammer leathers. The originals were there, partially preserved, which was unusual. He looked at the rest plank, the pin spacing, the case joints. He played every note in the compass, slowly, listening. But the thing that told him the most was the tuning pins. They were hand-forged. Modern replacement pins, the kind used in 20th century restorations, were machine-made, identical to within fractions of a millimeter. These pins were not identical. They varied in exactly the way hand-forged pins varied, subtly, individually, with the small inconsistencies of something made by a person rather than a machine. And they were not replacements. The wood around the pins showed the same aging pattern as the rest of the rest plank. These pins had been there a very long time. He photographed them. He documented everything. When Dr. Fenn returned, Tom told him what he'd found. "The instrument hasn't been significantly altered," he said. "What looks like modern intervention in the action is actually a period repair, late 19th century, not 20th. The tuning pins are original. The case is original. The hammer rail has been partially replaced, but that's consistent with heavy use, not inauthenticity." Dr. Fenn was quiet for a moment. "You're confident," he said. "I'm as confident as the physical evidence allows," Tom said, "which, in this case, is quite confident." Dr. Fenn looked at the instrument. The previous 2 conservators who said it was altered, they're experienced people. "I know," Tom said. "I think they were looking at the hammer rail and making an inference that wasn't supported by the rest of the evidence. It's easy to do. You see one thing that looks wrong and it starts to color everything else." Dr. Fenn was quiet again for a long moment. Then he said, "We have an advisory panel meeting in 3 weeks. Would you be willing to present your findings? Tom said he would. Felicity found him afterward in the museum lobby, holding a postcard she'd bought from the gift shop, a reproduction of an early 20th century landscape, all cold light and birch trees. How did it go? She said. Fine, he said. Probably fine. Did you figure it out? Yeah. She looked at the postcard. I got this for the shop, she said, for above the workbench. He looked at it. It was a good painting. The kind of painting that made you feel the cold just from looking at it. Perfect, he said. They walked out into the October afternoon, Felicity adjusting the strap of her backpack, Tom carrying the canvas bag. The Parliament buildings were visible at the end of the street, stone and copper green against the gray sky. Can we get poutine? Felicity said. Absolutely. They found a place 2 blocks down that had been there since 1987, according to the sign. They sat at a table by the window and ate without talking much, which was fine. It was more than fine. It was the specific, unannounced contentment of 2 people who were used to each other and didn't need to fill the silence. Outside, the afternoon was going to dusk. People moved along the sidewalk with their collars up. Tom thought about the tuning pins. About the way the wood had aged evenly around them, the same deep amber as everything else. About how the instrument had told him the truth if you just gave it the time. He thought about Anna, which he did every day in ways he'd stopped trying to count. He thought about the morning she'd left for work, and they'd had a small argument about something. He couldn't even remember what, and she'd kissed him anyway on the way out the door. Impatient and genuine, and he'd been distracted and hadn't kissed her back properly, and then the phone had rung 4 hours later. He didn't let himself stay there. He had learned slowly that the grief was not a room you lived in. It was a room that was always in the house. Felicity was talking now, about a book she was reading, about something that had happened at school, her voice easy and animated. He listened. He asked a question. She answered it with enough detail that he asked another. Outside, the streetlights came on. They drove home to Hamilton through the November dark, the highway quiet, Felicity asleep in the passenger seat before they reached the city limits, the postcard tucked carefully in her backpack. Cold light, birch trees, the kind of painting that reminded you that winter could be beautiful if you were somewhere warm enough to look at it. The shop would be there in the morning. The work would be there. The harpsichord from a collector in Guelph was coming in next week, and there was still the upright from the church in Dundas, and the list on his desk that never quite got shorter. He didn't mind. He had learned to not mind. The city lights came into view through the windshield, amber and quiet, and he took the exit he always took, and turned onto the street he always turned onto, and parked in front of the building where he had built, carefully and without fanfare, a life that was his.